Showtime. Come on in. Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you're still energized and really excited after the keynotes this morning. I was pretty excited, too, to hear all that stuff at Build and this week. My name's Kathleen Wilson. I'm an architect in the Data Center and Cloud Center of Excellence. I'm based out of Canada, though I work for Redmond. And my main focus is to build services IP around the adoption and operations around cloud. So I focus mainly on the people and process because I work with a lot of really smart people who are also in this room that understand the technology. So thank you for coming to our session. If you didn't get a chance to read the abstract, I know it's small form factor on the phone. Today we're going to really talk about some of the organizational challenges we've seen with customers adopting cloud. Share with you the Microsoft Cloud Vision. You will be able to repeat it verbatim by the end of this week. We're going to share with you something free, a nice free goodie, the Cloud Services Foundation Reference Model, and then give you some takeaways if your organization's considering adopting Azure, you've adopted Azure, you're at a roadblock, and we're going to bring some context from some real customer case studies in there. Come on. These. Obviously, I can't. Why is this not working? Okay, so it's not clicking for me. There we go. Can you click the poll for me? I don't like transition slides, and I present with Niels a lot, and he knows how frustrated I am. Like, I hate transitions. So just to kind of level set some of the information, the first question is like, how many, I want to go roles. So how many people here are IT pros, right? Okay, good. How many of you are cloud architects? You may put up your hand, IT pro, cloud architect. How many people would consider themselves technology decision makers for their organization? Okay. See, we'll have to change. It's just understand. And who's a business decision maker? Who makes the decision for the business? Got any developers in the room? Okay. Great. Any of you, by show of hands, who's using Azure right now and considering it? Okay, some of you. That's great. And how many are familiar with ITIL and IT service management? How many people have got accreditation? Okay, good. So you understand. So I want to make sure they said it. And how many here as an organization are using Office 365? Great. So we came up with some good examples. Want to make sure we did that. Thank you very much. I can now handle the clicker. So a little bit about why we did this session. We've done, Niels and I presented a few times internally. But why this session? Well, it's actually my job. So I was hired in about almost 18 months ago into the Data Center Center of Excellence and the Cloud Center of Excellence because we were getting feedback from our customers that it was challenging from an organizational and process perspective to adopt Azure. It's just not moving. Your organizational model, your operations models, Microsoft help us. So we're getting customer feedback. It was my job. And so when I started in role, I went into that other search engine called Bing, and I typed in IT service management in the cloud, and you can see by the results, it was just more vendors trying to sell me something. They were selling me a product. They weren't telling me what I needed to do organizationally. So I found it really challenging. So I started off on this journey on some of the work I've done in the past with private cloud and setting up organizations for private cloud and started looking at what did it mean from an impact. And I met a lot of great people. And, I reached out globally in Microsoft to services people and found out some people have actually done this. And the challenge is the customers don't necessarily want to reinvent it. They just tell us how to do it. So we decided from these offerings that I built and a lot of the nuggets of knowledge we're going to give you today is really prescriptive guidance. It's like, you know what? Just take it. You just have to modify it because these IT service management has been riddled with failure in the past. I don't know how many people have failed that they've had a successful ITIL, ITSM journey by a show of hands. Okay, nobody, just for those of the recording, nobody raised their hand. Okay, so that was one of the things where we had to, as an organization, is I no longer use the word IT service management, I use modern service management. Because I don't want to be seen as a failure, and I need the people and process to be sticky to the cloud. And IT service management was a very paper-heavy base, and clouds demand modern service management. They need to be lean and mean around automation. Automation's key. Nobody picks up the phone and calls the service desk, hello, I would like a VM in Azure, please. Okay, it goes through the change management process. That's too thick. That takes too long. Realize if you don't enable IT organizations as a service provider internally, the cloud's just a credit card transaction away. If you're not going to give me that compute, I'll just go to a website and order it myself. I can get it. So the idea is that you need to understand that clouds require service catalogs. They need to be automated. They need to have the approvals and the business logic, and this needs to be all ingrained into the cloud and automating and managing clouds. And as IT, as they move to be a service provider, they need to show their value add back to the business, right? Because they're like, well, I can just go and buy it. Why do I need on-premise IT? So we're working with customers to show them this is how you become value-add service provider in your organization if you're leveraging Azure. We're not getting rid of jobs in IT operations by people moving to Azure. We're just going to focus on higher value demand. So I'm going to start off first with some of the organizational challenges. So level setting, these are some of my opinions. There's lots of opinions of why people are moving to the cloud. But why organizations in the cloud is that they need to be innovative. You know, they find traditional, it takes 6 weeks to get access to, you know, compute power, network, and storage. It takes on forever. Found too, and I know some of my peers in the room have been out talking to customers, some people are looking at cloud as an opportunity to move out of expensive outsourcing agreements. And if there's any outsourcers in the room, I apologize. I don't mean any disrespect. But we've noticed that they had outsourced and they were in a steady state. And even when they outsourced, they weren't getting the innovation that they needed. So what they're coming to us is like, we want to put this workload into Azure. There's seats up front here and there's some seats at the side. And if you're comfortable sitting on the floor, you can sit on the floor back there. Thanks for coming. And then the fact is we're not going to discourage shadow IT because shadow IT is here to stay. We're not going to eliminate it, especially with the advent of platform as a service, you know, what some of the other cloud competitors are going to do. We're going to need to embrace and work with shadow IT so they don't go around you and cause security issues or put inappropriate data in the cloud. You know, IT, on-premise IT still needs to maintain control and become that service provider. Data centers are at capacity. I know Niels, my colleague, is from the Netherlands. There's a huge issue with just running out of space in the Netherlands. There's no more space in the data centers, so people are trying to shift workloads into Azure. It's attractive that you only pay for what you rent. So think about, I came from the banking industry in Canada, and we had a huge building just sitting there waiting for a disaster to happen. We actually had to pay for that infrastructure, and we weren't using it for anything. So one of the great things, the scenarios that I like, is disaster recovery on Azure. Think about customers, when you ship a new service, you immediately snapshot it, set up in Azure, and you have your DR already done. You can just turn it on, and there's lots of tool sets. And that's really enticing because I can shut those down. I only pay for them if I need them. Gartner, Forrester, all those other groups are saying cloud is the next thing to go. So it is an industry trend, and it looks like more workloads are going to be moving to the cloud. And with the onset of DevOps I see as a big hot industry trend for the next year for me at Microsoft. And there's many more. As I said, this is not, I could go on, but then you guys all know why organizations are moving to the cloud. So what we find, and we use these massive email aliases at Microsoft, and there's about 1,000 people on that email, and the biggest one now has been chargeback and showback. And really it's like, how do you set up an organization? Because when you start consuming services, their expectation is they're going to get a bill or they're going to see something. On-premise IT rarely ever showed a logical bill to the customer when they were providing on-premise, and cost models were very difficult that people could actually compute that. Now we're asking them to use Azure, and we're guilty at Microsoft. It's like, oh yeah, we have this partner product that shows you showback. But there's also looking at how do I build a chargeback or showback model that incorporates my fixed costs and my people costs? Because that just shows you Azure compute usage. It's not talking about the delivery of service end to end and what it takes from a human resource perspective. I have a former customer in the room here right now, and I had to do that. I actually had to show for a private cloud is build out a cost model and show to them for the first 3 years, I think it was, how much it was going to cost for them to run a private cloud for application test and development. And I had to incorporate like licensing costs human resources, training, the desk that they sit at. Other feedback from my colleagues that have taken some of the work that we've done around that is that cloud requires some process and organizational maturity. And a lot of organizations think by just computing in Azure, it makes them already mature. But what we found is they're shifting some not so great habits, very manual processes, and trying to do them in Azure, and we're just setting them up for failure. So the idea is that we need to be lean and mean. IT, again, ITIL was all about being service providers, but at cloud, you have to become a service provider. You need to be that gateway between on-premise compute resources. You need to determine with the cloud, and you need to be quick, or they're just going to go to the website themselves with a credit card and spin it up. We can enable innovation, and most of you heard about containers. Like that is just going to help us with the actual physical aspect of managing lifecycle management, components. Think container services. You build all those components in there, and people are now managing services because they're containers, and we've been able to actually draw a box around it. A lot of manual premises aren't automated, and very similar like the example I said, calling a service desk. So a lot of people just assume you go to a VM, but you need to do the approvals. How do your approvals work? And one of the other things that we found is it's even challenging for the people who consume cloud services because they have new responsibilities. They need to identify and articulate what services need to be on a service catalog, how they integrate with that, what customer service relationship management is, understand what tenant ownership was. Many years ago, I was working on our Office 365 adoption model because we had a lot of customers that moved to Office 365. And they struggled too. It's like, who owns the relationship now when I'm renting my Office from Microsoft? Well, you still need to have incident management on premise. You need to understand, who can create email distribution lists. You need to add and use, you're doing that on premise on behalf of the business units. So that's the introduction. I'm going to hand it over to Niels to go a little bit over our Microsoft Cloud vision, and then we'll move in a little more to the actual operating model.
That is true. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, the mic is on. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Niels Nijweide. I'm a Microsoft consultant in the Netherlands. I'm focusing merely on cloud, organization, and process. And I do that with a lot of customers, actually, globally at the moment. One of those, the thing that I want to talk about is not only the Microsoft Cloud vision, but actually how to translate it into a modern IT organization that can actually leverage the cloud. And by doing that, I want to start with actually this picture. I am hoping that everybody in the audience has seen this picture before. This is our picture, our way to address our space within the enterprise world. So we want to provide towards our customers a single consistent platform and experience across the on-prem world, the cloud world, and the service provider world in terms of virtualization, data management, etc., etc. That sounds great, that you be able to pick up a workload, a service, and that you can move it around across the on-prem world, the cloud world, and the service provider world. But that has actually a great impact in the IT organization as we know it today. The first thing is, an IT organization, as we know it, is merely focusing on operating the data center, operating their services and delivering those services. But if you look at this picture, the focus is not so much on operating the services and the data center. It's more like moving and orchestrating the shifting of the workloads towards the different boundaries. So it's more like a broker instead of a typical operator that we see in the current situation. So acting as a broker is one main thing that an IT organization needs to do in the future in order to actually consume the cloud in a proper way. So how does an IT organization do that? So first of all, it needs to consume standards. The only thing that is key here is standardization, is consuming standards. If you build a service, if you build an application, if you build a solution, and you want to run it on top of Azure, it needs to be standard. It needs to be within the Azure boundaries so that it can run on top of that and move on the on-prem and on the service provider environment. If it's not standard, then you can only run it in your own data center, and you treat it like you always treated it before, but it's not really cloud. So standardization is key here. And one of the things that's also different is that the IT organization is not the organization that actually is defining the standards. The standards nowadays are being set by the cloud providers, so in this case us. So it's not a demand-driven model anymore, it's a supplier-driven model as we speak at the moment. So what does that mean? The business, if the business has a question, a functional question, we want an application that does a certain amount of things. Instead of the IT organization building that application according to those requirements based on the building blocks that he has, nowadays he needs to look what standardized services the cloud provider has to offer, and based on that he can create that application so that it can move from the on-prem world, the cloud world, to the service provider world. And that's a mind shift for many organizations, that it's not top-down anymore, but it's bottom-up. And again, standardization is key for that. My clicker doesn't work either. You need to stand here. No. Oh, yeah, there we go. No, that's the one too far. Okay. So we talked about standards, and we defined our standards based on the modern cloud principles and concepts. I showed here in this slide all the cloud principles and concepts that we currently have. A lot of bullets and blocks, so don't bother reading them all because the fonts are way too small, and I will dive into them later. But you see here the fonts we have, the blocks we have, the principles we have that we currently use to build our technology, both on-prem, both in the cloud, and both the technology we provide to our service providers. These concepts are, by the way, posted on TechNet. I put in the link at the bottom, so you can go there and find out those concepts for yourselves. What I want to do is dive into those concepts and take a few, because I cannot have them all and explain them all, because we simply don't have time for that. So I want to pick out a few and explain the impact for that particular principle or concept for the IT organization. So not for the technology, but for the IT organization. But because what you see is that those concepts also have a great impact on the organization itself and on the people and on the processes. So let's start with the principles. And the most important items here that I want to emphasize are these three. So first of all, Kathleen already mentioned it, was the take a service provider approach. If you want to succeed in the cloud world, you need to be a cloud brokerage. So you need to act as a service provider towards your business or other IT organizations. And consider those IT organizations or those business units as a service consumer. So you as an IT organization are the service provider providing the cloud service, and that can be a private cloud, that can be a public cloud, that can be a service provider cloud, but you need to round it up and provide that towards the customer. Another thing is, and that's, I think, obvious, is minimize human involvement. If you want to succeed, you need to automate processes. Some things you cannot do, simply not do, if you not automate your processes and you're still doing things manually. An example is the next principle. That's perception of infinite capacity. And that's something we all can recognize in if we talk about cloud. If you talk about Azure, it has infinite capacity, or it has the perception of infinite capacity. But that's not all. The IT organization itself needs to apply to that as well. One of my customers, for example, has a guy that is accountable for all the IP addresses in their organization. So he has a big Excel sheet with all the IP addresses, and if somebody wants a server, then they go to that guy and they say, okay, you need to have that IP address, and you can go. So that customer moved to the cloud, but they still left that IP guy as they were. So if the moment that they provisioned the server, they still needed to go to that IP guy and said, okay, I provisioned the server in Azure, I need an IP address. Give me that IP address. So yeah, you can all imagine that it's not the power of the cloud if you push a button and you have to wait a few days before your service is provisioned because the IP guy is at holiday or it's weekend. You don't want that. So IP addresses is something you need to apply capacity management to. And IP addresses is a scale unit. So it's not only within the Azure space that capacity management is there, but scale units still exist within the IT organizations. And you need to define those in order to really leverage the power of cloud and automate it. So that's what happened afterwards. So if you look at concepts, it's the same. I want to start with the first one. Yeah, there we go. Favor resiliency over redundancy. What does that mean? It means that in the old days, back in the days, all business critical solutions, applications will build redundant. So that means everything is built up double. So if one component fails, the other one takes over. That's great because the service is always around even when one component fails. But if one component fails, the incident management process is kicking in because that component needs to be fixed as soon as possible. And if that's in the evening or at night, somebody has to be called. If that's in the weekend, somebody has to be called. So incident management in the traditional world, in the ITIL world, is a reactive process. If a component failed, somebody needs to respond to get that component up and running again. If you look at resiliency, it's another way of building your application. So instead of building 2 components, you're building 4 components. You're building 6 components, 8, 16, 32. So if you have 32 components doing the same thing, and one fails, that's no big deal. If 2 fails, still not a big deal. So you see that incident management becomes a proactive process. It's something you can plan. And you can plan, let's say, we're going to fix all the broken components every Monday from 9 to 10. So that way, you don't need to call somebody at night, you don't need to call somebody at weekend, and you have a planned maintenance process that you can work with. So your incident process becoming much more lean and mean if you do it like this. Elastic infrastructure, is something everybody knows as well. And one of the things I want to mention here is that it's actually quite simple within Azure to implement that, to configure that. If you have a simple website, front-end, and then with a few front-end servers or web roles, it's quite easy to configure it to scale up automatically and scale down automatically if more load is put on those front-end servers or those web roles. But it also has a huge impact on the IT organization. What do I mean? I mean if a website, let's take that simple website, it's scaling up, at that point, it's getting more servers. And if you use the traditional incident process, and one of the front-end servers will fail, you need to create a ticket pointing to that front-end server. So you need to have that listed somewhere in your CMDB, that front-end server is there and is broken. So the moment you scale up, all those components need to be in the CMDB as well. Otherwise, your incident process will fail, or your change process, because it applies the same rules to that. So it's nearly impossible to have a real-time CMDB that can cover and that can cope with that dynamically behavior about scaling up, scaling down. So at this point, you need to discover that it's not a problem that you don't know what kind of components there are, because you simply can't. You simply don't know at any point in time. If you apply those elastic rules, you simply don't know at any point in time what kind of components you have within your environment. It can be 10, it can be 20, it can be 300. You simply don't know. And it's simply not possible to have a CMDB real-time, up-to-date, so that the processes work. So instead of managing those components, you should manage the services and the containers, like Kathleen was mentioning. And if you do that, you don't care anymore what kind of components, what kind of VMs, web roles, worker roles are within that container. You're simply managing that container, and if that container is broken, then you create a ticket and you look at what's in the container at that point in time. So that's a big difference, where at the moment we actually managing components, we're managing VMs, we're managing databases. And in the cloud world, you don't care about that anymore. You're managing the container, you're managing the service. And what components are in there can be different in any point of time. So that's a huge difference. Consumption-based pricing is also a huge business. This is where, and Kathleen was saying that as well, customers are very much struggling with, at least all the customers I talk to. And what I did for the last customer, for example, what they want to do was to have control, because an IT organization and a business organization on top of that, they want to have control. They have a budget, and they have a budget of, let's say, $1 million that they want to spend for a certain service. And within clouds, you don't know what you are spending. You know what you're spending at the end of the month. So it can be half of 1 million, but it can also be 2 million. You simply don't know. But customers do want to take control of that. And yeah, that's for the right reasons. So what we did there, and that's actually a bit of a wide space area at the moment, is that their self-service portal was created and was an extra change request. A standard change was created that actually allowed customers to create access towards Azure. So if you want to have access towards Azure, you go into that self-service portal and you said, okay, I'm that person, that's my role, that's my manager, that's my task I have to do, and that's the amount of money I allowed to spend. And there was approval cycle behind that, and once that approval cycle was there, the customer was getting access to Azure, and he can do whatever he wants, and he had the power of the cloud. So he had a push of a button, he had a VM, a push of a button, he had a database, but within the boundaries that he was allowed to. So that's an example how consumption-based pricing is different and can be filled out at the moment. So if we take the concepts, we're going one step further, and we're going to the service delivery models. And again, the models itself are, I think, quite familiar. You have the infrastructure as a service, you have the platform as a service, and you have the software as a service. And on the right hand, you see the traditional world. The traditional world, the most organizations nowadays, the teams are stacked on top of each other. So they are more or less stack-oriented. What does that mean? That you have an OS team that's managing all the OSs. You have a database team that's managing all the databases. So if you want to do a change in one of those layers, you need to inform the layer on top of you, and you need to inform the layer below you, because everything is dependent from each other. And therefore, we have very complex change management processes that make sure that things don't break if you actually perform a change. The benefit and the advantage of cloud computing is that there are no dependencies for certain things anymore. If you take a virtual machine from Azure, the fabric you don't know what it is, and you don't care. It's there, and Microsoft is managing it, and yeah, you don't know where it is and what it exactly is, but you have your VM, and everything in your VM you can do yourself. For PaaS, the same applies. Everything below your web role or your worker role is managed by Microsoft. So you don't care anymore, and as long as you stick between the boundaries, your application will run, and you don't know if changes are being applied at the bottom or changes are being applied at the top to a certain degree. So with that in mind, you see over here that the platform as a service is a model that allows the containerization, that allows another way of thinking, of organizing your organization. So instead of the layering, you see here that a DevOps team is tilted, and you see a vertical approach. So a DevOps team, for example, is accountable for the instances, for the databases, and for the code in there. So everything in there is the accountability of the DevOps team, and within that way, they are able to move very agile, very quickly, and keep up with the pace of Azure, but also of business demand. So this is a way to also, again, make the processes less lean, more lean and mean, and less complex. And if you move to the left, and you see software as a service, it's becoming even more simple from a process perspective, because Office 365 is one big black box, and you don't know what's happening in that black box. You only need to do a few things at the top, and again, the processes, the ITIL processes, are at service level. So somebody in Office 365 breaks, and you don't know if it's a server or what it is, but something breaks, and that's it. So it's very, very important if you move to the cloud, if you want to set up your cloud organization, that you know what kind of service you are going to deliver towards your service consumer organization. Is it IaaS, is it PaaS, or is it SaaS? And how do you want to organize your organization? Is that SEC-oriented, like in the right, where you see the more complex and traditional layered model with the more complex processes? Is it the containerized form, where you are able to manage your life cycle within a container? If it's an application, a service, resource groups, multiple resource groups, but manage a life cycle within that container and be agile from that point of view. So, if we know the service model, we can go deeper. And again, I need to push this. So, how do we go deeper? For that, we have a Cloud Services Foundation reference model. That's a reference model. Again, this is published on TechNet. The link is below that. And you can find it and there. And it's an ITIL-like model that we use to define a cloud service and describe a cloud service. I'm not saying that ITIL is dead, but what I was mentioning is that the responsibilities within ITIL, so the way that we actually perform the processes, are quite different within the clouds. So therefore, we move towards this model. So that's not only we see the processes here, but also the technical pieces are covered in here. So you clearly see on the right hand, on the blue part, left hand is that, by the way, you see the fabric, the platform, and the application. So the IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS service you're going to deliver. You also see the management and support. That are the capabilities that you need to operate and deliver that service. So that's monitoring, backup, identity, and you name it. And in the green, you see the processes that are required. And first of all, the service operations, so the processes that are required to operate the service, like incidents, change management, all those kind of things. And on the top, you see the service delivery processes, so the processes that you need to deliver the process. And you see a process like continuity, capacity, and lifecycle management, and those kind of processes. So, again, this is published on the internet. What we did on top of that is that we put a role model on top of that. So, for every, yeah. Sorry about this.
Clicker.
It's moving here. So for every block, and you see in the blue, you have different roles. So you see at the bottom, if you have a fabric, you need to have a fabric administrator. If you have a platform, you need to have a platform administrators. If you have an application, you need to have developers and operators. And this look very simple, but what we did is to have an overview, to have a perspective overview. Okay, if you're delivering a cloud service, what kind of roles do you need to deliver that cloud service? And this is the model we came up with. And if you go further, you see that for the capabilities, the required capabilities, we need a management and support administrator. And finally, for the processes, you need the process roles. And you see that we took an approach to also do this lean and mean as possible. So if you look at ITIL, for example, you see a lot of roles. And what we did is combining those roles as much as possible to this level of degree. Again, this is a starting point, so in some circumstances you see that roles are being split or more roles are being introduced, but this is a basic set of roles that we expect within a typical cloud organization. So you have the service manager, the person that is responsible for actually talking to the customer and the end responsible for delivering the service. You have the reliability manager, who is responsible for the compliance, for the difficult words, for the compliancy of the policies and those kind of things. And you have your architect, and the architect is the one that's creating the guidelines, making sure that you keep with the standards, and holding the design and those kind of things. And on the right hand, you see the operation manager. And the operation manager is responsible for all the operational processes and making sure that everything is keeping running within the cloud service. And last role is a typical cloud role. That's an author. And what does an author do? An author has actually two typical accountabilities. One of them is managing the service catalog, and from a technical perspective. So he's actually maintaining the templates, the service templates that are in the service catalog. He's put lifecycle management on that, he's uploading them, he's changing them. So that's one accountability of the author. The other one is the automation part. So automate the processes from a technical perspective. So he's the one that actually needs to automate all these kind of things. So these are the roles that we expect to be in a cloud organization. But again, how does that fit in the delivery models that we already saw? So IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. So if you go to the next slide, you see the same roles plotted in the different delivery models I just mentioned. So let's take infrastructure as a service. You see 3 blocks. At the bottom, you see the cloud provider, that's light blue. In the middle, you see the service provider. So the brokerage functionality, the one that's actually delivering the service towards the service consumer organization. And that's the pink box. So you see here 3 types of organizations within this model. Whereas the pink service consumer can be a typical cloud-oriented organization that you used to have. The service provider is the new organization, cloud organization, the brokerage organization that you need to set up. And the cloud provider organization is the one that's actually providing the cloud. So if you look at platform as a service, you see almost the same picture. Only the bar is a bit higher for the service provider. And what you see is that the platform administrator is now not in the service consumer organization, but it is in the platform. It's in the cloud provider organization. So if you have SQL as a service, maintaining and operating that SQL is being done within the cloud. If you have SQL, take SQL from Azure, you get a database, and every maintenance is done within Azure. So the platform administrator is moving into the cloud provider. Where you see as infrastructure as a service, it's still within the service consumer. And software as a service, you see that every role, so even the developer and the tester, is moving into the cloud organization. When in Office 365, you cannot do anything, basically. You only can consume the functionality that's given to you. And that's the difference between those three models. And again, and if you click the next slide, if you see how does that fit within a cloud world, a public cloud world, you see that the light blue boxes is actually Azure Office 365. So the only thing that will remain within the IT organization are the purple and the pink boxes that you need to set up. So that's basically the story I want to tell about building that organization. Again, I can talk for hours about this stuff, and we can go into much more detail, but again, there's no time for that at the moment. So what we want to do now is to provide you with some actionable takeaways so that it can maybe help yourself enable Azure, enable the cloud better, and have some tips and tricks in order for you in your organization to smoothen the process towards a public cloud implementation. And what we want to do is to take a cloud people and process approach, so not technical people and process, technology people and process, but cloud in this case. And for each subject, we have a few takeaways that we want to walk through in the end. So the first one is lift and shift. If you look at the current environments that customers have, at least the customers that I see that the organization, the environment is very complex. And what often happens is that they pick their virtualized environment up, move that towards Azure IaaS, and place that at the bottom again, and run it again. So that's possible, and therefore you have IaaS, but it's not actually leveraging the real cloud power. It's not actually consuming PaaS. And why do I say PaaS? If you look at the pictures at the beginning, you see that the containerized form, the low TCO, the low lifecycle, the lean and mean processes are actually only applying to PaaS. So if you want to benefit from that, you need to move to PaaS. And you cannot do only IaaS. And not only that, but PaaS is also cheaper than IaaS. So it's a two-way thing that you need to consider PaaS if you move to Azure. And by doing that, we recommend that, first of all, rationalize your current service portfolio, application portfolio, and see if some things can be done in PaaS and not blindly move them to IaaS. And sometimes it means that you need to refactor them. But if you do, you can actually leverage the lean and mean cloud organization and the lean and mean processes that I hopefully showed in the last few slides.
And we were working with a customer, and it was very evident that we didn't have the right people in the room when we were doing this, because we do a service mapping exercise where we talk about this application, they gave it a name, and then we talked to them as like, okay, who are the parts of the organization that consume this service? What do they use this service for? And we found that they had 5 SQL virtual machines, and they were just going to lift them and throw them into IaaS. And we asked them, it's like, what do these 5 SQL VMs do? And they're like, well, we use it for data mining and BI. And it's like, well, okay, and when do you do this? And they're like, well, we only use it a couple weeks a month. So we had to refactor and rethink the way we were going to do it, because we easily could have just thrown those 5 VMs and thrown them to Azure, and they would have hosting costs associated with them, and they would be sitting idle. And again, we could script them and bring them up and bring them down. But then we asked the IT team, is like, can you bring in the team that actually uses this application? We want to talk to them. And they started talking a little bit more about, and we were actually get them on, and we're putting them on BI. Right? It was like, well, why don't you look at Azure BI and use that instead? So it didn't take a lot for them to refactor that application and actually had 5 fewer VMs to host, and it was much more cost efficient because they weren't using the service as much. They couldn't tell us or we use it all the time, we only use it a couple of weeks, is that the service is always available and they don't need to manage those life cycles of those 5 SQL VMs. So that's where that takeaway you think about. When I'm lifting and shifting and throwing something in cloud, is there something I possibly could do better? And our tools, what we do is we use service mapping. And we talk about the service not as a component. We talk about what is the service? And they'll give it an application name. What does that application do? What is the business capability that it provides? Who are the different consumers of the service? How do they use that service to do their day-to-day jobs? So I just had to add that little bit of nugget of knowledge. And these things were very important to our customers, right? It's just like if you move them over, we're just picking up the same configuration or mess that you may have had on premise, and we're putting it in the cloud. We're not making it manageable.
Yeah. Another thing that is actually critical, and I cannot emphasize that enough, is subscription management. And again, many of the customers that I'm talking to at the moment are struggling with this. Because subscription management is actually the heart of Azure. And that sounds a bit strange, but subscription management is a way within Azure to do chargeback, to do showback. So actually the bill that you get at the end of the month is based on the subscriptions. The people that can access the resources within Azure is based on the subscriptions. The technical boundaries for a database, for a VM, and for the number of VMs that are allowed, the number of VNets, the number of express routes, etc., 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 are bound to a subscription. Configuration management, the things that I already mentioned. So what kind of components are there are bound within a subscription. So that subscription management is vital if you want to consume Azure at a large scale. So again, I cannot emphasize this enough. If you go to Azure and you're playing with Azure, think of the strategy for your subscriptions. Think of how do you want to grow your Azure environment? How do you want to embed more things into there? Start small, but think already, okay, how can we grow this? Because if you do that at the end, it's a long way to go back and to do it all over again. So start thinking of subscription management from the start.
And I've worked with, a lot of times I'm going, because customers say, tell us just, you know what, we don't even want to figure out. Microsoft tells us how to do it. So when I want to know how to do something, I go over to MSIT and I ask them. And one of the things that they came back is like, you really need to figure on the outcomes you're trying to achieve. Stop focusing on the how, step away from the blinking lights and the flashy things about subscription management. Think about, what do I need to show the consumers of the service when I'm done? Do they want to know how much they want to do that? Because we do showback at Microsoft. And within internal, we're trying to put everything into Azure. That is our goal, but we do showback. And the way that they handled their subscriptions is very capable because we do showback to the business unit, but we do not charge them because Azure is free. That's the mode of business we're going to do. But you need to understand as an organization is are you going to eventually have to show somebody a bill? Right? If you have to show them a bill, how do you break down the bill from an organization? My favorite thing is I say, show me an org chart of your organization, because your subscription management should line up to the business applications that map across the organization. So focus on what you're trying to achieve and don't necessarily worry about the how. And because the how is the technology and it's rapidly changing. But if you have to show a report or show a bill at the end of the month, you better think of how you're going to do it. It's like, what groups require bills and how do you group your billing? Yep. So these are things that you need to think.
Yeah. And what I currently do at a customer is that we're looking forward approach. You can do that functionally. So let's say it's a car company, you can do that by production, HR, and those kind of things. You can do that geographically, and there are all kinds of ways to set up your subscription and to get your bills at the end. So
it's not just the IT folks that are in the room to have that discussion, because it actually may spread across that. You may need to get somebody from finance in there to have that conversation with you. So it's not as just, subscription management is very black and white, but you need to cover the gray area before you address the black and white. So I'm going to talk, and I know Niels has been talking a little bit about think big and start small. And clouds demand maturity, right? Because again, we're delivering services. It requires you to understand how you provision, decommission, manage your services within a life cycle. And you organizations, by purchasing, and this is the feedback I got from the people who've delivered my offerings at Microsoft, it's like, you know what? You're great, Microsoft. You told us to go to the cloud. And the cloud is like step number 8. Well, I'm still on step number 2. Help me, Jeff's nodding, help me with step 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, please. And that's the organizational maturity. Just because you acquire a piece of hardware or software doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be better at delivering it. So what we've decided to do is specifically around standard changes. So when you move to the cloud, cabs become a thing of the past, right? You think about things as standard changes, and these get put on a portal as request offerings. I want a new VM. I want to decommission. I want to be added to resource group, remove it. That requires you as maturity as an organization to say, I'm okay with that, and that's a standard change, and it doesn't have to go through CAB, and I don't need a change advisory board to do it. So there's a certain level of trust, and you have to break down the silos. We recommend you start with one application or service first and bring it over to Azure. Don't try to do it all, because this goes around organizational change management. You are changing people's jobs. People are very worried at a new organization. What happens when you guys get a reorg in your organization? What's the first thing you do? You go to the PowerPoint where the org box is, and you look for your name in a box, because everybody wants to be in a box. They want to seem relevant. And this is the idea, is that if you start with it, how many people are familiar with the word bimodal IT? I didn't know there was actually, yeah, okay. I thought I was cool because I brought this up, but it's not. Gartner talks about it. So what we're talking about is that you leave your traditional on-premise management of your traditional on-premise, and you define a new organization. And somebody on the right-hand side of the room was part of that new organization and did with another customer. So you define your new cloud service, and you bring over the roles or the people over to that new service, and are only responsible for managing the new service moving forward. They don't go back and do the old things, and that's bimodal IT. It allows you to build a solution factory and not fail, because you're always checking. It's like, how is it running here? And as you bring things, you fix things within continuous service improvement in your new IT organization, and you can bring on more services because you gain that efficiency and maturity. So treat your new cloud services as greenfield, and don't bring over any bad habits. Another thing is that we want to, cloud removes organizational silos and also creates some learning curve for some people. You think about network, compute, and storage. Back in traditional, we're usually 3 different groups, right? So as you know, Neil's made that thing is when you made a change, you had to go down. If the network change, well, if the network team makes a change in any organization, they have to let everybody know, right? Because when you make a network change, a firewall rule, all services break within organizations. So the idea is you want to look at fabric management is removing all these silos, but what we found too is even working with customers is that some people don't understand networking. I was an OS guy. I managed services. I don't really necessarily know networking. So there's some training and education that you need to do, and you need to partner people up with a smart buddy to help them through that. So the idea is if you're delivering infrastructure as a service, platform service, and software as a service, make sure that your team is supported and organized with appropriate training or bringing the right groups of people together to achieve the task. So you can have multiple people perform one role of fabric management. So if you're looking at private cloud, and I'll talk about the Microsoft stack, is the person needs to know orchestration, orchestrator. They need to understand operations manager. They need to know virtual machine manager. They need to know Hyper-V. They need to know Windows Server. If you're using Service Manager or any other product, most likely that person from bimodal IT was the operations manager guy. Now they have a whole stack of products and services. I know when I worked on the private cloud tap back way on, I looked at virtual machine, I'm like, walked to the product group, it's like, tell me the virtual service templates, because I think I get it, but how would that make me more efficient in delivering cloud services? So it took a lot of education for me to understand what these services and products were all about. Yeah. So really think about shifting it.
Yeah, the example that I always use, and it's another profile, it's another way of thinking for people actually within the IT organization. If you look at the traditional world, I always compare that to McDonald's, for example. And within McDonald's, you have multiple people working there doing a particular task, and that task is described from end to end. So one is flipping the burger, one is sitting at the cashiers, someone is packing the burger, but they're all doing a single task. And at the end, the process is that much optimized that they do know from end to end how long it takes to actually make a burger from the time it's being ordered to the time it's going over the counter. And that's a form of process optimization that you normally see within ITIL, for example. If you look at the cloud, I always compare that to a beer brewery that we have in the Netherlands. That's a big beer brewery, and if you go there and you visit that brewery, you see the trucks coming in with the products, and being unloaded by robots. It's going to be unpacked onto the roller bands, and at the end, the beer is coming out in cans, and nobody touching in that entire process that beer. The only people there are people in white coats controlling the processes. So if something happened there, then they adjust it there and they adjust that something. So the process always keeps on flowing. And that is the profile that fits more within the cloud environment, where you have people that understand the end-to-end picture within that particular container. So like Fabric, they need to understand networking. They need to understand storage. They need to understand the hypervisor. So if something happened in the network, they need to understand what the impact is at the end so that they control that and be responsible for that. So I'm not saying everybody needs to be an in-depth expert of networking. No, you do have people that are more in-depth, but generally speaking, all the Fabric administrators, for example, need to have knowledge of that particular container. And yeah, that's the example that I always use here.
And then from a process perspective, and thinking about that, one cloud is not one size fits all, not much like the t-shirts you get here at Ignite, it's one size fits all. But again, the processes and roles, much like Niels explained earlier in his stories, they will change depending on the type of cloud service that you're delivering. So again, I love that document, and every time I deliver this presentation with Niels, it gets better and better and better with the waterline of where, what falls within the cloud provider, what falls within the service provider, and what falls in the cloud consumer. So understanding the roles and responsibilities will shift depending on the cloud model you use to deliver.
Yeah.
Managed services versus components, or this could even, after this Ignite and Build, manage containers instead of components. So really, when we talk about cloud and we talk about service consumers, they consume business capabilities of services. They don't consume VMs. They don't consume compute. So if we look at the fact is when you focus on services, define your services. If you're thinking of moving that service, draw it down. Understand who consumes the service. What are the key components to deliver that service? Who's the organization responsible for that? And manage services from end to end. It's not lifting and shifting. And if you're going through that service mapping exercise and somebody can't answer that question, you don't have the right people in the room. Because it's not just the guys, the IT pros or the developers that need to be in the room. You got to start thinking about the people who consume the service and what's the business capability that service is delivering to the organization.
Yeah. And again, the example that I gave, especially if you use elasticity, you cannot manage the components anymore. It's simply not possible. So you need to manage the services. And yeah, that's another way of thinking.
And that's where, some people got challenged, and that's why I went with modern service management instead of IT service management, because what does ITIL say that you must have? Anybody, just shout it out. Yes, exactly. And it's if you go, it's like in search of the Holy Grail if you try to create a CMDB in the cloud. The fact is we need to think about at a higher level. You need to abstract it a little higher. Is not knowing it's like, yes, I'm using Azure PaaS for a database. I've got some databases. I've got some front-end servers. I've got some web roles, and it delivers a service. So again, when you take and you discuss service management in the cloud, you need to take away some of the things like it's not necessary to have a CMDB. It's necessary to have a service when you're managing the cloud.
And you do have a CMDB, but it's a higher level. So you have the services in there and not the components anymore.
So before I go this, because I want to see some questions as well, because we gave ourselves, we kept it so we give 10 minutes for questions. We're also at Ask the Experts tonight. Niels, if there's anything specific you want to see a bit more, you want us to dive down and deeper into any of these topics. But really, in closing, really think about when you go to change management, it's about sometimes you have to let go of your control and looking at standardizing changes, right? Look at things that are repeatable, low risk. Tiered SLAs, bronze, silver, gold, no longer exists. Just drop that from vernacular, right? The service provider provides the service level, and once you put it into Azure, everybody's getting gold. Let's say the tiered, I touted that 4 years ago. I wish I repeated that. I said, tiered service levels will die in the cloud. They don't think. Service catalogs, you need to understand what are the services your organization consumes? Who are the consumers and what are the business capabilities? You need to know that before moving to the cloud. Automation, you need to automate. Ruthless standardization leads to better opportunities for automation. Where ITIL focuses on big, heavy paperweight processes, cloud makes you look at procedures. How do I do it end to end? Much like the story of the brewery in the Netherlands, it was like what happens here, when it happens here, and what happens through the steps, and we need to automate that. One thing I say to customers, if you can't write it down, you can't automate it. Culture needs to shift. You need to feel comfortable about being disruptive or be in that uncomfortable zone for a while. And this is really looking at, you may need to spin off that bimodal IT type of organization and have a greenfield organization just focused on this disruption of bringing cloud in, and then bring the others along as you migrate more services. Processes need to be lean and mean. We have some service offerings around Microsoft that do help us. One called Azure Operations, which this one was built on. We did private cloud operations.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay. There's a link there you can go to. If you have any questions directly, there's my email. Please feel free to reach out to me, or you can tweet me at @MKathleenWilson. I do tweet regularly the new rules of ITSM in the cloud. So when I'm not at conferences, I talk a lot about what needs to shift in an IT service management world with the cloud. I'd like to thank you all. If you're going to ask any questions, if you're shy, I don't mind. We'll repeat the questions. Please use the microphones so the people who listen to this recording, it doesn't sound like we're answering dead air. So thank you very much for your time today. As I said, feel free to use the mic or just come up and talk to Niels and I. Thank you.